All right, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us for our second Chautauqua virtually. First, I'd like to apologize for those of you who joined us at the beginning of the live stream. We did have some technical issues. So if you did have any problems at all viewing the performance, I encourage you to go watch it this week. It will be up through Sunday evening at mdchautauqua.org or on our YouTube channel. So definitely don't miss out on that really fantastic video. My name is Stephanie Boyle, and I'm a program officer at Maryland Humanities. For those of you who don't know, Maryland Humanities creates and supports educational experiences in the humanities that inspire all Marylanders to embrace lifelong learning, exchange ideas openly, and enrich their communities. I am joined today by a mother-daughter duo. We have with us Joanna Guy and Liz Cannon. And I'm just gonna go ahead and turn your camera on there, Liz, if you are ready.
Seems like she may be having some technical difficulties over there.
I'm here.
Oh, okay.
Okay, there we go.
Here we go.
There you are, wonderful. Well, thank you so much for joining us today. For those who are joining us live, you can leave your questions if you are on Zoom in the Q&A section. We already have some great ones in there, as well as if you are streaming us on Facebook, you can go ahead and leave those in the comment section. And we will do our best over the next 30 to 45 minutes to answer as many as possible. And today, my guest asked if we could start off by polling our audience. So those of you who are joining us on Zoom, I'm going to go ahead and launch a poll for you to complete. We want to have an idea, how familiar were you with Alice Paul before this performance? And the second question is, have you seen The Vote on PBS? It premiered, I think, last week. So we're getting our results in now. Seems like the majority of people had some familiarity with Alice Paul before your performance. Some were not, 42% were not familiar at all. 10% were very familiar, and it looks like 71% have not seen The Vote yet. So we definitely encourage you to do that. This will help as we have our conversation today about, what do you already know about Alice Paul and what more do you want to find out about her? So I'm going to let that poll go for just a few more seconds so we can kind of get our end results in there. All right. So yeah, we have 47% of our viewers today were somewhat familiar with Alice Paul, and 29% have seen The Vote. So I'm going to just start off with asking you all a question, which is, what inspired you to portray Alice Paul?
Sure, I can kick that off, and this actually goes back over a decade. Our interest in Alice Paul and my interest in Alice Paul. I mean, as a woman, she's a very inspirational figure. She's the reason today that we have the right to vote. And if it weren't for her pushing for that, we may not be in the position that we're in right now. But my interest in her, as I said, started about a decade ago when I competed at National History Day with a monologue portraying Alice Paul. Now, 10 years later, my mom and I have both stayed really involved in the Maryland Humanities Council, and we thought it would be great to pitch a performance of Paul for Chautauqua. And due to our familial resemblance, we thought it would be a pretty cool kind of tactic to portray her at about 30 years of age, and then later in her life in her mid-80s. So that's kind of where the inspiration came from and how we thought about developing the performance. And Liz, if you have anything to add, feel free.
No, I think that's a really good recap of our personal journey learning about Alice. And I would just add that, we were so kind of enthralled with her story. It has so much drama, so much significance. We really wanted to share it. And we felt, I think, this year in particular, with the celebration of the centennial of the passage of the 19th Amendment and the concurrence in this year, 2020, with the final state needed for ratification of the ERA. That was Virginia in January, just passed it. And these are two of the big themes in Alice Paul's life. And so it just seemed like what a wonderful choice she would be for this event.
Wonderful, thank you. And that sort of segues into my next question for you, which is, tell us how you put together this performance. You know, how did you pick what time period was going to be, you know, the younger Paul, and then Paul reflecting later in her lifetime?
So I'll just speak a little bit to the younger Paul, and then you can talk about, Liz, the great primary resources that we had on hand when Paul was in her 80s, which I think is the primary reason that we picked that time period later in her life. But we each wrote our own parts in terms of just tactically putting the performance together. We each wrote our own monologues and kind of honed them down based on what we thought was interesting, and also based on issues that are happening today that we thought, you know, even in the 1920s, things are really still relating to 100 years later. So Mom, do you want to talk a little bit about the primary resources that you had on hand for Paul in her mid-80s?
Yeah, sure. So, I mean, the breakdown was kind of obvious in a way, because Joanna was portraying her when at the end of the suffrage campaign, and that was in 1920 when Paul was 35 years old. So it really made sense for her to talk about that campaign, which in her involvement in the US lasted about 7 years, and then, you know, her life prior to that, to help us understand who she is as a person, what was her life like when she grew up. So it made sense for Joanna to take all of that, and that was really much of that was covered in her original History Day script, but it was expanded for this performance. And then as the older Paul speaks, you know, she's going to try to cover the rest of her life, which was from the age of 35 until when she's speaking her mid-80s, and she died in 1977 at the age of 92. So she lived a very long life, and there was so much that occurred in all of those decades after the suffrage campaign. So we really wanted to try to give at least equal time to that.
So I'd like to start taking some of the questions we have from our audience here. A great question we have here from Patricia is, where are we today as far as the ERA passing?
I'm not an expert. I think, you know, legal experts could comment on this. It's very complicated, very messy, and it probably depends who you ask. But I think there's probably some hope for people who believe that this is still needed. And that's because there's been a lot of renewed interest and activity. So the ERA failed to get the required number of states, 38 states, in 1982, when the time limit expired. And Alice talks about that in the presentation. That was something she fought against, but nevertheless, that limit was imposed. It was extended by 3 years, but then it expired when there were only 35 states that had ratified. So just in the past few years, Nevada in 2017, Illinois in 2018, and then just this year, Virginia, have gotten us up to 38 states. So that's fantastic, but there remains this question of, well, what about that time limit? Is it valid? Some legal scholars think that it, you know, could be overcome, and in fact, Congress passed a resolution in February. It would still have to go to the Senate, so that is in process. There's a further little footnote to all of this, because in all of these years, there are 5 states that originally passed it and have since rescinded. And so there's a whole nother constitutional question about whether it's even permitted for states to rescind their approval. And a lot of legal scholars think, no, that wouldn't be valid. But in any case, it's just to point out that there are still many, many questions and many legal issues that would have to be sorted out. But the bottom line is, I think it's very much still alive today.
Yeah, and the only thing that I would add to that is there's this huge resurgence today of interest in the ERA, obviously because of the recent passage in Virginia and the passage for 3/4 of state ratifying, there's actually an organization called Generation Ratify, and it's a youth organization composed mostly of students under the age of 18. And those are exactly the people that need to be involved in this movement to ratify the ERA. Because a lot of people don't even know about it that are that age. So it's really, to me, I think a great sign to see youth start to participate in this movement and to understand the significance of the ERA. And Jennifer Carroll Foy was a huge leader in ratifying the ERA in Virginia. And she had this really poignant quote just about, when a young girl takes out her pocket constitution and she's looking at this language, she needs to be able to see on paper that she is equal. Because a lot of people say, oh, the ERA is just symbolic, it won't actually change anything. And Foy says, symbols matter. The flag matters as a symbol, the anthem matters as a symbol. This is important. And so I think it's great to see that youth and organizations like Generation Ratify are popping up all over the place now.
Wonderful, thank you. We have another question that sort of goes back to, you started discussing your primary sources and what you used. And let me just find my question here. You all are doing such a good job. I have to scroll around sometimes here to find what I am looking for. Okay, so from Elizabeth, we have the question, did Alice Paul keep a diary? What were some amazing primary sources you used to learn about her? And she says, thank you both for your wonderful performance. And I will say, Liz and Joanna, if there's any of the primary sources you want me to share that you provided, just let me know and I can share that with the audience too.
Okay. Well, thank you for, I'm glad you enjoyed the performance. And I would say for those of you who were here with us last week with Margaret Brent, where there's hardly any information, not much historical record, it's the opposite is really true with Alice Paul. So that, we're very fortunate that there's so much out there, primary and secondary resources both, that we could consult. At the same time, that can be a little bit overwhelming. But I'll just mention a few things. We read a number of good biographies, and then we also consulted a number of different articles. There are amazing resources available online. I think the Library of Congress just has this incredible archive of photographs, especially in the suffrage era. And then there are many museums and organizations that have online exhibits, especially this year with this 2020 centennial. So some of those that were extremely helpful to us would be the Alice Paul Institute, and they have their 2020 online centennial exhibitions. Also the Belmont Paul National Monument. This is located in Washington, D.C. It's actually the headquarters of the National Woman's Party starting in 1928 for many decades. Joanna and I visited there, and they have some great online resources. The Women's Equality Museum up in Seneca Falls, we visited there as well. So there's a lot of great things. And then there are also this year some great exhibits through the National Archives and also the National Portrait Gallery. I would encourage you to, you can easily Google these things and look at them. However, the single most valuable resource, primary source to us in this developing this portrayal was a recorded oral history interview that Alice Paul did in 1972 and 73 as part of the University of California Suffragist Oral History Project. So she sat down for extended sessions with the interviewer, and that's the woman she's talking about at the very beginning. Her name was Amelia Fry, and she talked about her whole life and working on equality. And this was great because you can actually listen to the audio recordings. You can hear what Alice sounded like at that age. And that was especially helpful to me to try to, capture her voice and her personality. And then the transcript of that interview is about 750 pages. So there's tremendous detail in that. But I did find that we have to be careful because her memory was great. She was very sharp, but there were a few things that she, for whatever reason, either because she didn't recall or she just didn't want to say, that it was important to cross-check against other sources. So there was a lot of great material, and we dove in, and there's probably a lot of things that we didn't even know about because there's just so much out there.
Great, thank you. So I want to move on to another topic of discussion. We have a question here from Peggy and Harry, and they asked, do I understand correctly that in the early suffrage movement, there were disagreements between the groups about methods? I thought Alice Paul was considered too liberal and too radical. True?
Yeah, I mean, I can just kind of take a stab at this. I speak to this a little bit in my monologue, but there were definitely big differences between the approach of NASA and the approach of the National Women's Party, which of course Alice Paul was the leader of. Of course, they both had the end goal, but one of the things that really frustrated Paul is that NASA wanted to take this state-by-state approach to getting the vote for women, and she said, that's not the right way to do it. We need to take a federal amendment. And so NASA kind of, I think, always had this, I would say kind of more of like a soft pedaling approach than the National Women's Party. And another thing that was interesting is when you look at the approaches of women even outside of the United States, like the suffragettes over in London had even more militant methods than Alice Paul had, and they would have been considered even more radical than the suffragists in the US.
Yeah, I mean, I think that there was a definite split there. Initially, Alice Paul did join the National American Women's Suffrage Association, NASA, but it lasted for maybe less than a year because she was frustrated with their plotting approach, and they saw her as this young upstart who was coming in. She was raising huge amounts of money. When she took over the congressional committee, NASA had given that committee $10 a year annual budget. And the prior year, where it had been run by the wife of this congressman, she had actually returned some of that $10 because she didn't use it all. So they really were doing absolutely nothing. And then Alice Paul and Lucy Burns came in and they said, we're going to take this seriously. The federal amendment is the way to go. In the first year, they raised over $27,000, which was an immense sum at the time. And they put this big procession on that Joanna describes in her portion, and did many, many other things that were unheard of. And so this really shook NASA up. I think some of the women in the leadership were threatened by these young women, and they really didn't approve of the tactics. So in short order, the NWP, began as the Congressional Union, but then it split off. And before the campaign was over, there were these two different rival camps that were opposed in terms of their tactics that they used, but working toward the same goals. So it was sort of an odd situation. But I think ultimately both approaches contributed, both groups contributed to the success of the passage of the amendment.
Thank you. And I want to talk a little bit more about something you brought up, which is the violence that was involved, and that, throughout your performance, you described the physical abuse the suffragists faced in the UK and in the US. Were you surprised to learn about those tactics and how they were taken, particularly the force feeding and the isolation? And while you all answer, I'm going to share some of the primary sources that you all put together, which are fitting for this conversation.
Okay. Joanna, were you surprised?
I was shocked to learn about that and that was happening in the United States. So yeah, I mean, that's, I guess, the short answer, but it's pretty gruesome to hear about some of the things that happened to these women in these prisons, women in their 70s. Unfortunately, we still see things, it's still pretty relevant to today. These atrocities are kind of still happening. But yeah, I was certainly shocked to learn about it.
Yeah, I was as well. And I think it's important to note that, well, 2 points I would say. And one is that the women themselves were always opposed to any kind of violent protest. They're called militant, and maybe that suggests to some people that they were violent, but they really weren't in any way. And Alice Paul modeled this behavior. She always wanted to have peaceful demonstrations, and she would never react or try to incite any kind of violence herself. However, it's true that in this first procession, they were attacked by members of the crowd and hecklers. Later on, when they started marching with their banners and picketing the White House, and especially when they started using Wilson's own words against him to show his hypocrisy about freedom and democracy, they were attacked. They were attacked by soldiers and sailors. And in one incident, a shot was even fired through the window of their office, which was at that time very near the White House. So violence was perpetrated against them both during their protests and then obviously, as Joanna described in great detail, during their or during the time that they were arrested in prison, the forced feedings. One thing that I was very interested to note, this goes back to what I said a moment ago, when you listen to Alice speaking about all of this as an elderly woman, she really downplays it. She, throughout her life, was very reluctant to even talk about the forced feeding. She was interviewed a few times when she returned from England, but she really didn't like to discuss that. And in later years, she would try to dismiss it. And then when she was talking to the oral historian and recalling the procession, she was asked specifically, wasn't there violence? What about the congressional inquiry that occurred because of all these incidents? And she said, oh no, it really, they just made a few comments to us. I found that kind of odd.
I think you're on mute.
Sorry about that. There we go. We had a question over on our Facebook, which was from Geraldine, and she wanted to know, was there a motivation behind imprisoning these women? I mean, what was the sort of end game by doing this?
I'm sorry, could you repeat that again?
Absolutely. So she wanted to know, what was the motivation to imprison the women?
Well, I think that the record suggests that Wilson was kind of behind this himself. And I think he was just fed up with Alice Paul. She really was this terrible thorn in his side. And at that time, there was I think a delicate balance on this whole question of public sympathy and public support. I mean, I think we see that today in a lot of the social protests that are going on. It's, you know, it can really affect things greatly. So I think he was hoping to just get her out of the way. And when she and her team were out there picketing, the other suffragists were saying, no, we're going to participate in the war effort. And so her rivals in Nassau had really put their work for the amendment on the back burner. And Alice said, no, we're going to proceed. And then when she started, and that was very, very controversial. And then when she started picketing the White House, using his speeches on the banners, and then later burning the speeches, she kept upping the ante. And I think this really got under Wilson's skin. You know, when they started, he would just smile as he walked in the White House gates, tip his hat to them. But behind the scenes, this was a big problem for him. And so they wanted to get these women off the street. They arrested them. But then again, Alice upped the ante, you know, because she said they're not, you know, we need to be treated as political prisoners. We need to be given decent food. The treatment was so horrendous. And that's when she went on her hunger strike. At that point, then Wilson realized, uh-oh, you know, I can't do this. We got to let these women go. So that was how that little struggle, I think, kind of went back and forth. And ultimately, I think Alice won.
Thank you. So I want to shift gears a little bit. Joanna, you have behind you one of the flags. So we have a question from Valerie asking, what is the symbolism of the flag design? The colors are actually purple, white, and gold. Do we know the reasons why? And she said, I'm assuming that the stars represent the states that ratified it, but maybe not. So can you tell us more about the flag?
I think Joanna's on mute. So do you want me to go ahead and start? So
yeah, go ahead.
This is a replica of what the NWP called their ratification banner. And they constructed this once the amendment was passed by Congress, and they then had to get, at that time they needed 36 states to ratify. So the stars represent each state that ratified. And yeah, and so that's right. And every time that a state would ratify, they would sit down in their offices and sew it on there. And there is a photograph of Alice sewing a star on the banner. So all of this, became like a PR vehicle, like so much of what she did. As far as the colors, those, go back to earlier in the movement. The National Women's Party adopted the tricolor of the purple, white, and gold, and there was tremendous symbolism. The purple is a symbol of loyalty, white for purity, and then gold symbolizing light and life. And the National Association also had banners and sashes, but they did not have the gold color. And then the suffragettes in England, their colors were white, gold, and green. So each organization kind of had its own take, but all of them used these colors and symbolism for their movement.
Thank you. And we certainly have been seeing that a lot this year with the centennial. You'll see lots of publications, and it's really the colors that have been adopted. We have a question here. Let me just go ahead and find it. Oh, sorry about that. Okay, sorry about that. So we have a question here that I think is an interesting one, and it's sort of the gap we have, right, whenever you portray a historical figure. Kathy asked the questions, what would Alice think of modern women? Do you think she'd be shocked, or do you think she'd be pleased, or somewhere in the middle?
I think, she would probably be, unfortunately, I don't think she would be quite as shocked to learn that we're still fighting for the ERA. I think that unfortunately she wouldn't be that surprised to know that we don't have it yet, because she pretty much called it. She said, we need to get this ratified outside of this 7-year limit. That's going to be really difficult for us. So I think on that front, she wouldn't be surprised. In terms of what she would think about the modern woman, I think this would be a really interesting time for her to be living in, especially because now we're seeing a lot of other movements kind of take up arms with the women's rights movements, like the trans rights movement, LGBTQ rights, and it's also, we know now, like, you really can't separate racial equality from women's equality. And I think we're going to speak to that a little bit more about Alice's kind of stance in terms of race. But I think she would be happy about some of the progress that has been made. What do you think, Liz, in terms of how she would think about the modern woman and the modern feminist?
I think she would definitely be pleased to see the increase of women in positions of leadership, whether it's in the business world with CEOs of corporations, women in politics. I mean, she'd probably be thrilled that Nancy Pelosi is the Speaker of the House, and that women have run for the highest offices in the nation. But I do think she would be disappointed that we still don't have what she called ordinary equality through the Equal Rights Amendment. She did say late in her life, when she was talking about all the objections that were being raised to the ERA, which I reference in my segment there near the end, oh, we're going to have women in combat and homosexual marriage, and all those are actually her words. And she didn't really say what she thought about those things. What she said was, that's not my business. My business, our business, is simply to ensure that women get their freedom. I may not like what they do with that freedom, but that's not my business. And that's very, I think, typical for Alice. She was kind of a very private person. Although we have so much information about her and the work that she did, personally, we don't really know that much about what she thought or felt. She didn't really have a political party affiliation. And so her views on current events and other topics, we don't know all that much about it.
Thank you. So Joanna, you brought this up, but we hear towards the end Paul talk about how the Women's Party is made up of people of all races, religions, and nationalities. But then later, Paul admits that her sole focus was on women's rights. So how did you work that really important conversation into your performance? And what sources did you consult as you were wrapping your head around how to portray Paul specifically around race? And we have a few questions as well from audience members along the same lines.
Were you gonna, oh, I'll take that, okay. So this was, I think, by far the most challenging part of the performance, even though it's a pretty small segment, because we wanted to be accurate in addressing some of these questions in her own voice, but you know, it's a very sensitive topic. And so what we looked at, first of all, was, you know, what are the incidents that she has been criticized for, and what did she say about them? I mean, in the performance, we highlight the segregation of the Black women during the 1913 procession. And I think the way she related the story is accurate. However, in her interview, she didn't ever say, as she does in our performance, if people say we were unwelcoming, or that we excluded, or that we perpetuated segregation, we did do that. Well, the fact is they did do that. Alice herself didn't say that. So that's why we were trying to, you know, portray it in an accurate way. And I think if she had been looking at it from our perspective, she probably would have acknowledged that. She didn't apologize for it. And she also references recalling other incidents. And there were cases where at the time it was a terrific battle to get the amendment through the Senate, because there was a bloc called the Southern Wall of senators who were so opposed to it because they didn't want to enfranchise Black women. And they said, we're not going to do it because we have to maintain white supremacy. It's really shocking to look back at the speeches and letters, because it wasn't hidden, you know, they were just upfront, and this is the language that they used, and it's really awful. But this was the political reality that Alice understood, and others. Carrie Chapman Catt, who was the leader of NASA at the time, wrote a letter to Edwin Webb. I was just looking at this, so I'll share it. And she concludes it by saying, if you want white supremacy, why not have it constitutionally, honorably? The federal amendment offers the way. Well, I mean, this is just awful. But, you know, Carrie Chapman Catt, if you asked her, was she a white supremacist? I'm sure she would say no. And probably people don't think of her that way, but she understood that she needed to construct this argument in order to try to persuade these senators. So it's very complex, and it's kind of ugly, really. But again, that's why it was so difficult. And when we wrote that section of the performance and rewrote it, we consulted Dr. Jean Baker at Goucher College, who is an expert on suffrage, and she was extremely helpful to us in trying to kind of balance all of these different objectives that we had. So we hope that it makes people understand Alice, and hopefully it'll make people think as well.
We have a follow-up question to that from Nyla. She said, did Alice Paul ever apologize to Ida B. Wells or minority women in general for agreeing to meet demands of some women who refused to march with women of color?
Not to my knowledge, no. I mean, she, in 1921, no, I think it was 1919, when they were trying to, again, get this through, she had given an interview and said that they were really working to get white women to vote in the South. And Mary Church Terrell and her organization, the National Association of Colored Women, came out publicly and, you know, asked her to retract this, and they passed a formal resolution condemning these remarks. And, you know, I don't know what Alice Paul thought of that at the time, but again, much later in life, when she was talking about Mary Church Terrell and her association. She said, oh, we always worked very well with them.
Thank you. We have a little bit of time left. I do want to ask a little bit more about your performance. So we have a question from Clarence, and he asked, when you do this program live, how do you coordinate the two actors in the two time periods?
I mean, we can both answer that, but luckily we got to do one version of this performance live at Goucher College, which was a really neat event because there's a wonderful historian there, Jean Baker, who also taught us a lot to prepare for a Q&A and to kind of learn more about the history at Goucher specifically. So when we did that performance, we essentially just had a screen. And of course, Liz comes out first. So I hid behind the screen, and I think a lot of people didn't even know there would be a younger Paul coming out. And as we're going to transition, Liz says, I was standing right here at this desk. And then she goes behind the screen, and I come out and launch into my performance. And we make the next transition through the use of a wine glass. And again, we're hoping that familial resemblance kind of helped to carry that transition, that Alice Paul was the same person. But that's essentially how we do it live. And then you'll notice in the video, a phone also rings, and the younger Paul answers it when she learns that the legislation is passed. And in real time, we basically did this with Liz sitting behind the screen and pressing a button to make it look like the phone was ringing. So we came up with a few little techniques for making that come across live. But it was interesting to transition it digitally, and thanks so much to Derek McDonald and McDonald Films for helping us do that, and to Our Town Theater. And just kind of another funny little tidbit is that Liz and I performed in the Diary of Anne Frank at that same theater about 8 years before. So it was really cool for us to be back in that space together again and to be able to film there.
Yes, except in that case, I was playing your mother because you were Anne and I
We
was
still had the familial thing going.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, so the live version is just so much fun. We were disappointed not to be able to do it for Chautauqua, but there were some advantages to filming it that we didn't really expect. And I would say the experience is completely different because when I'm portraying Alice as an older woman in the stage version, I'm kind of walking all over the stage. And as far as those props go, that's a little tricky because I have to get that 1920s phone out onto the table and all of those pictures. But I do that, you know, when I'm starting to recall the past, and then I have to pack them up again later. But in the film version, you could see as you watched it that it's very close up. I have to say I wasn't really comfortable with that camera right in my face, but Derek he's an actor and he was a great coach, and he really helped us to kind of tone the whole thing down. And I think the result is that it makes it a more emotionally nuanced performance, and it's kind of more powerful. And that was something that I didn't really expect. So I think they're actually quite different, but each good in their own way.
Great. And another quick one that someone caught, Julianne asked, she noticed in the segment where we have Paul later in her life that she has on a pin.
Yes.
Is it the same pin that I was showing earlier, the jail cell pin? You have it there with you?
Yes, I have it here. So this replica, I think maybe you can put that slide back up, but this is a replica of the Jailed for Freedom pin. We bought these at the Belmont Paul House, the National Monument in Washington, when we visited there a few months ago. But that pin was given to all 168 of the National Woman Party picketers who were served jail time. And so you can see it has a cell door, and then there's a little heart-shaped lock on it. It was based on a pin that the British suffragettes created, and Alice Paul earned one of those. In fact, she wore it on her gown when she got her PhD in 1912. She was very proud of it. And just one other thing I would say about this, it's one more example, you know, large and small, of all of the the important spectacles and symbols that Alice Paul brought to the campaign. She recognized that how things looked was really important, and she had such an amazing artistic vision. And so this pin is just one example, because it served to, kind of galvanize the feelings of camaraderie that all of these women had. And then kind of a bigger thing related to the prison was that she got these trains to go and travel all over the country, and the women would go on speaking tours about their experiences, and these were tremendously popular. They would wear their prison garb and they would go on the prison special and talk to huge crowds about what had happened to them. So it was just all part of what one historian calls the visual rhetoric that Alice Paul employed in the successful suffrage campaign.
Thank you. So we are running out of time, but I have one last question from Dana. And I think it's a great question to end with. She asked, if you had the chance to have Alice Paul over for a family dinner, what would you hope to ask her about, and what might you serve?
So that's from Dana Thomas, who's actually a friend of mine. So thanks, Dana, for joining the live Q&A. And I think it would be really interesting to ask her about like intersectionality, especially because she kind of took such a stark stance of, like, she had this one-track mind toward women's rights. So I would really love to know, like, to just ask her forthright, would you have done anything different, knowing what you know now? And I would also love to know, like, what her stance is on, I would love to hear her tell me personally what her stance is on like the intersectionality of trans rights as a part of the women's rights movement, LGBT rights as a part of that movement. And then I would also like to ask her about racial equality. And I would love to know if she would have handled that differently, knowing what she knows now.
Yeah, I would just agree with all of that. And I think it would be very interesting to ask her to talk about her views on and kind of explore the difference between equality and equity, because she talked about equality, but equity is something different, and is something we're talking a lot more about today. I'm not sure that it was necessarily in her vocabulary, but how would she understand that, and what would she think about it? And as far as what to serve, I don't know really what I know that I wouldn't serve her meat, because she didn't eat meat. And also I wouldn't serve her any tea and cakes, because suffrage teas were a big thing way back in the Victorian era. But Alice was just not a tea and cakes kind of person. And, she was pretty much all business. So.
And we definitely wouldn't serve her eggs and milk.
Right. No, we wouldn't do that either. Yeah.
As seeing that that's what she was force fed.
Exactly.
So yeah, maybe just like a nice lasagna.
Well, thank you so much, both of you, for joining us here today, and for everyone who has continued with us as we do this live Q&A on Facebook and on Zoom. We have been recording our questions, so we will be sharing that out as well. If you missed a part or you have a friend who you think might enjoy it, please do feel free to share. I just want to remind everyone again as well that this performance will be up through Sunday evening. So we are taking down our videos because this is something that Liz and Joanna do elsewhere. As they mentioned, they've done a performance in Goucher, and they're hoping to do more either virtually or in person in the future. So we are putting a time limit on that, which we hope makes it feel a little more special. So you can see their performance through this Sunday evening at mdchautauqua.org. And each week in July, we'll be doing a different performance and hosting a live Q&A. So I hope that you will join us next week as we learn about a woman who Paul knew well, and some of you asked in the question section, as well as the founder of the NAACP, Mary Church Terrell. So thank you, ladies, and thank you everyone who joined us this afternoon.
Thank you.
Thank you, Stephanie.